Fancy, a retrospective of Prints That Fly by Stephen Hoskins. Due to COVID and lockdown restrictions in the UK, this exhibition was entirely recorded and photographed in my small studio in North Somerset. Gull Wings. Created during a month's residency at the Frans Masriel Centre in Belgium, the inspiration came from a model glider that I had built as a teenager in the late 1960s called the Mini Moa. The structure has remained in my memory ever since, partly because the model's construction was a scaled-down version of full size, so consequently the parts were minute strips of wood. After 3 months building, the model flew once and disappeared from sight, never to be seen again. The decoration is deliberately of an artificial domestic wallpaper that never existed. However, it is loosely based upon a copy of an 18th century Scandinavian wallpaper of peacocks that hangs in my home. I wanted to make aeroplanes friendly and homely, partly because building model aeroplanes was an integral part of my childhood, and partly to counter the fact that all models from my youth were automatically decorated with roundels and signs of war. I wanted to bring that commonplace domesticity and happiness we used to associate with going on holiday in aeroplanes and travelling to warm sunny climes. That air of wonder has disappeared in recent years, and we no longer view aircraft as objects of desire. In future, the wonder and scarcity of flying may again become part of the collective memory. The construction drawings made in Illustrator on my Mac laptop were created in an old-fashioned analogue manner using digital technology. Therefore, the drawings had a flat front elevation, side view and plan, a process taught me as a schoolboy studying technical drawing. The shapes were laser cut directly from Illustrator and only became a three-dimensional object when finally slotted together. Malay kite wings. This piece, shaped like a traditional Malay diamond kite, was a transition between my kite prints and the aeroplane wings. This was one of the first shapes I made when I first took up kite flying over 40 years ago. However, these wings have a Clark White airfoil section that is traditional in aeroplane manufacture. But an airfoil section only ever happens in a kite that has no rigid spars, such as power kites for kite surfing. This was an early attempt to repurpose the roundels traditionally used on Royal Air Force planes and give them a more decorative function. The piece is backed up with the artificial rose wallpaper that is common to all of the early wing pieces. The roses are a notional representation of a wallpaper that might have existed, but never in the form in which I have created them. Belgian Wings. Created at my first residency at the Frans Masriel Centre, this, along with the left wing and right wing prints, was the first to use imagery directly printed onto balsa wood. I wanted the structure of a wing to have more prominence, and all the imagery to enhance the structural elegance of a wing rib, so the viewer would understand there were two sides of a rib, and it is this structure that holds the whole wing together. Rose wing. My first true aeroplane wing after making kites for 20 years. I originally came across an article about a model aeroplane created by my uncle, Eric Higlet, in 1951 called the Hoppet. The Aero Modeler magazine article explained how my uncle, at the age of 17, created an award-winning model aircraft. This sparked memories of my childhood roots of making and flying model aircraft. I made a wing which had a section similar to those that I made as a boy. The covering is very light inkjet printed tissue, highlighting the construction without reverting to traditional model aeroplane cellulose dope, which, although it tightens everything and makes the tissue transparent, gives the whole structure a tight and unfriendly look. The uncoated tissue has a gentle appearance in keeping with the softer look that I required. This was also the first time I had inkjet printed onto such a delicate tissue. Rose Wing 2. I invariably make pairs of prints or three-dimensional structures. I have no real rationale as to why I do this, apart from the pragmatic. When I have all the elements on screen or on file, and I can make a companion piece to the first work that I have made. I also have a liking for the symmetry that occurs when the works are hung together. There is no doubt I like order within my prints. This second wing has some open areas, so the construction comes through and exposes the balsa ribs and spars. Lilienthal feathers. I wanted to make a work that reflected my life, my interest in the history of flight, and the fact I was going to undertake a residency at the Hong Kong Print Workshop in May 2020. Inspired by Otto Lilienthal, an early flight pioneer who documented his experiments with gliders and managed to fly further than anyone else between 1891 and his death in 1895, the experiments were based on early biomimetics trying to replicate bird flight. Based upon Lilienthal's structures, I created feathers, screen-printed with a design loosely based on a chinoiserie wallpaper panel from Wootton-under-Edge in Gloucestershire, near where I live and work. A design inspired by China that originated in England, referencing both myself and China. Any regular visitor to China sees T-shirts and clothing with slogans and sayings in English that make no sense to an English native speaker. I had translated several epigrams from my daily life, such as a pint of gold and cottage pie and chips, into Mandarin and Cantonese. There is a truth to my life in them, but would make no sense to anybody just reading them. These sayings are inkjet printed onto lightweight handmade paper. The whole work was physically assembled on top of a plan drawing made on traditional brown craft paper. Drawing all of the parts on top of each other in plan allowed the analogue construction of the digital parts to be relatively accurate. The plywood feathers are laser cut. One of its delights is the accuracy it brings to assembling complicated shapes. However, each and every balsa wood part was cut in the traditional manner with a scalpel. The 3 scalloped central wings were assembled in an analogue manner using a hand-drawn paper template on an old-fashioned drawing board with compasses, parallel motion and set squares. The parts are pinned to the drawing board and then glued in place, with the scalloped parts first being steamed, bent and pinned into place before gluing. The covering of inkjet printed tissue when glued to the balsa wood frame strengthens the structure. The wings are kept apart by 12 balsa wood wing struts covered in white handmade paper. The structure is given support by a series of Dacron threads similar to wire stays used in early aircraft construction. Aolus 1. These works are inspired by the pioneering work of the Frenchman Clement Ader, who built a steam-powered aircraft that purportedly flew 50 metres at height of 20 centimetres in 1890. Whilst Adar's Aoli was a bat-wing-shaped aircraft with a large fuselage to house the steam engine, I wanted to create something that had Adar's bat or prehistoric wing look, that I could combine with the natural feathers and look as if it might have flown in a bygone age. Made during lockdown, the Aolus works are a reaction to being confined to the house and my studio. Fortunately, I was able to walk the dog on the nearby beach and hillside every day, and during my walks I started to collect bird feathers, mainly magpie, swan and starling, with a few wood pigeon and sparrow. I needed to make work that did not require me to laser cut, digitally print, or make new screens, as I no longer had access to the CFPR's extensive workshops. I was forced to go back to my roots and create work that recycled whatever was available to me in my studio. Aolus 2. An extension of the previous work, but with the addition of a feathered tail section. The 13-gram covering tissue is screen printed with a peacock design derived from the wallpaper in my front room. The plywood fuselage is painted white with carbon fibre rods supporting the tissue covering. The tail feathers are swan and magpie. Left wing and right wing. The left and right wings are a return to my childhood, and also to my early 20s as a screen printer in a large editing studio. In my 1970s childhood, when one built a model aeroplane, first you stuck down the plan onto a piece of softboard, and then built your aeroplane directly onto the plan. I wanted to replicate the experience in a print. I also wanted to make a screen print that had hand-cut and autographic qualities of the 1970s and 80s screen prints. Therefore, the print had to include graph paper, which one drew upon constantly to create an accurate basis from which to draw and cut screen print stencils. Also, screen-printed blended colour, which I would print all day and almost every day in the earlier 1980s as a master printer. These prints were made at the Frans Masriel Centre in Belgium, where the custom is to leave a print as a donation to the foundation. Because this is a diptych, I named the prints left wing and right wing. The Centrum only wanted the left wing in line with their philosophy as a studio. To soften the work and maintain a continuity, the ribs were printed with a rose pattern I had created for my residency. I also wanted the prints to change colour as you walk past them on the wall, so from one side they're essentially pink and from the other blue. Uphill plane. This was the first iteration of the rose pattern so common across the aeroplane works. Whilst it may appear very similar, it had yet to be divided into its constituent parts and then reassembled, so that each layer could be easily broken down for screen printing. The uphill aeroplane was at this stage a complete model sans engine. The reference to Uphill is where I currently live, and the drawings were made in my home studio. French peacocks. This print was a slightly larger extension of my miniature prints. Every so often I make prints that are essentially a quarter-size sheet of an artist's imperial-size paper. The size allows me freedom of ideas that can be quickly printed and easily made in my studio. The print incorporated the Swedish wallpaper motif and printed and folded sheet of handmade Nepalese paper that has been cut by hand with a set of old-fashioned cutting compasses. 70s wallpaper. This print is a companion piece to French peacocks, using some of the first set of stencils, with a new set of wallpaper stencils based on the 1970s wallpaper of my youth. The dominance of orange bears witness to the colour of my bedroom at my parents' house, which surprisingly for the era, I was allowed to paint aged 16. Homage to Buckminster Fuller. This piece is an interim work that relates both to the Kite works and Buckminster Fuller's tensegrity structures. I often make work that I term work on the way to somewhere else. These are works that occur at the start of one series and at the end of another, where one is trying something new and needs to make a leap of faith to begin a new phase of work outside of your comfort zone. It is at this point the work on the way to someone else occurs. They are often solo works that might never develop further. Sometimes they just languish as an aberration in the scheme of work. This piece is currently in that phase, and has sprung new ideas and references past work, but has yet to develop into a new body of work. Golden Section 1. The Golden Section kites are transition works between the geometric abstract work that I made in the 80s and 90s, and the new kites I began to make in the 2000s. Based upon the harmonic proportion, more often called the Golden Section, the kites take their shape from a Golden Section drawing influenced by early Renaissance art that formed the basis of many of my prints. I wanted to bring some colour and form to my kites, and not be constrained by traditional shapes. I did, however, want to make kites that looked as though they'd been conceived as kites. The images are screen printed onto handmade Japanese paper that can be stretched and formed around the glass fibre frames that are tied together using traditional knots and then glued. Digital Golden Section Kite. One of the first digital prints that I made. We had just purchased an early NovaJet wide format printer, and I was experimenting with its capabilities to print on handmade Japanese paper. I was also experimenting with fitting random patterns created in Illustrator to the Golden Section format, and to find an alternative to the abstract paint strokes and washes that I had previously used. Digital ears. Digital ears were an entertainment to try and break from and resolve my formality within kite construction. It is definitely a piece on the way to somewhere else. It is, for example, a huge influence on the seminal Lilienthal feathers, reminding me that I can lose my rigid adherence to a perceived correctness of form. Hamamatsu. Hamamatsu was my reaction to the denigration of craft skills that occurred during this period. I wanted to make artworks that were essentially crafted in any context other than framed behind glass in a gallery. It is the shape of the traditional Hamamatsu Japanese kite, screen printed onto handmade Japanese paper and assembled with glass fibre rod and over 90 traditional kite knots holding the frame together. Miniature prints. I have been making miniature prints for 25 years. The prints here are divided into three groups: aeroplanes, kites and folded prints. The aeroplanes are miniature trial ideas for the larger works, the Albatross being the first in the series and Flight of Fancy being the second. One delight of the miniature print form is the ability to take a small or fun idea and run with it, trying to keep it contained in a small jewel-like format. The kite miniature prints came about through a number of projects that evolved from the larger kite prints. In particular, an early international digital print portfolio. I liked the idea of making images that reflected the larger objects and allowed me to trial ideas quickly. Carp and Gozzoli in particular brought together many of the earlier influences in one little print, and the W-form kite was a kite I'd always wanted to make, but never got round to making in the flesh. The laser cut prints were a fun attempt to learn how to use paper with the new laser cutter we acquired in 2005. In a miniature print you can make mistakes and reassess very quickly. I also wanted to see how I could push the delicacy of the format, learning on the way that you can make very fine cuts that are much easier and more accurate than hand cutting. Laser Cut 3 in particular is a favourite of mine, as it was all printed on a desktop laser printer on handmade paper, then laser cut and combined with carbon fibre rod.